So we're going to go ahead and begin. So everybody, good afternoon, and welcome to our first new initiative called Justice Leadership Initiative. So yeah, virtual applauses or snaps. I'm so excited for us to be here. We have a great presentation and great presenter with you all today. And so I'm going to introduce Leonel Lopez, a little bit about Leonel Lopez. Leonel Lopez serves as the Assistant Director for the Office of Diversity and Inclusion at St. Edward's University in Austin, Texas. In his current role, he is
I want to see her a little bit more as like excited than the rest. So I think
do you want to put yourself on mute?
Traits, it would be more accurate to her character.
I think they're just sitting talking.
Like, she's jumpy, I guess I can see her as. So she would be the type.
Okay, there we go. I think there was a student talking. It's fine. Remember to mute yourselves. So in his current role, he is the founder and leader of the Masculinity Initiative. In addition, Leonel has created a community machismo workshop for the San Antonio Library. Leonel has also created and led a two-part sexual violence prevention and toxic masculinity training at Texas Lutheran University, which is given to Black and Brown men. To add, Leonel is currently teaching a freshman seminar course titled Gender and Sexuality in Pop Culture. He has experience in advising Latinx student organizations and has specifically worked with Latinx male student organizations for the past couple of years. Current position, he ran the Male Leadership Program in Austin Community College. While in graduate school, he facilitated a freshman dialogue series where he focused on men of color. And during that time, he was awarded the 2017 ACPA Coalition of Men and Masculinities Grad Student New Professional Award. So please help me welcome Leonel Lopez.
Gritos all around. I'm not going to do it right now because I'm in my office, and I'd probably scare all of my peers, but know that I am giving a grito to all. Thank you so much for having me. Again, my name is Leonel Lopez. I use pronouns he, him, his, and just as Nayeli shared, I am the Assistant Director of Diversity and Inclusion here at St. Edward's University. It is my absolute pleasure to be here. I'd like to first thank Nayeli for inviting me and being here. It's an absolute privilege and honor to share this opportunity to have this conversation. One of the conversation that I feel is absolutely necessary in so many different ways. Thank you, Nayeli, for like talking about like all the things I've done. But to be honest, like it's such a great pleasure of mine to do this. And I'm going to go ahead and talk about why I feel as if why these conversations are so essential. As I might have shared before, this topic of machismo is an important issue, is an important topic that we have to be able to incorporate within our daily lives. It is a topic and a concern that so many of us have experienced in one way or another, but have had difficulty in putting into words how it has affected us. And hopefully by the end of this presentation, I might be able to help you out and do that. And hopefully also by the end of this, there could be some questions and answers. So we're going to go ahead and talk about Latino masculinities. But before we do that, I want to make sure that I'm giving a proper heads up to what we're about to encounter here. And that is one, the generalization of terms like men and all that come with it. The reason I say this is because as we kind of have conversations around men, manhood, boys and guys, there's always a certain type of individuals that we're talking about. And one of the things I want to be able to separate is that when we talk about men and when we talk about young boys, we typically are talking about heterosexual cisgender men, especially heterosexual cisgender white men. And this is a very important frame for us to be able to deconstruct. As we're going to be able to talk about Latino masculinities, machismo, and all of that, we have to be able to understand that the experiences are very unique to that individual. So whenever I say terms like men, I hope that we're taking an intersectional lens to it. We're not just talking about straight men, about cisgender men. We're not just talking about men who meet the stereotypes of violent, aggressive men. We're talking about men who are in our queer community as well. We're talking about men who are first generation, either Americans or students. We're talking about men who are gender fluid. We're talking about all types of men here and how those men involve and are a part of their society. And if at any time there is heteronormative language used in this presentation, I'm going to go ahead and try to call that out. The reason for this is because machismo is typically around heterosexuality. There is a strong narrative around how men, especially brown men, are meant to behave and perform. A lot of it deals with the heteronormative idea. Heteronormativity is the assumption that all individuals are straight, are heterosexual. And also, there might be times in which we're talking about gender binary, either man or woman, male or female. Especially within the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, we don't believe in a gender binary. We don't believe in gender expression having to match your gender identity. We don't believe that gender and sex are one thing. We have to be able to break them up as well. That is not just men and women. There are multiple types of gender identities, gender fluidity as well. And that is an important aspect as we continue to have a conversation around masculinity, especially in masculinity for men of color. And also, these kinds of conversations are going to be held with a higher educational lens. Higher education is an amazing thing. I have my entire career in higher education, but there are privileges associated with it. I understand that I am a first-generation American. My parents are both from Mexico. I'm a first-generation student. But whenever I come into places that I get to be able to speak about this, speaking about higher education in and of itself and be able to involve yourself in higher education is a privilege. Because I can have these conversations here with you all, beautiful people. But these kinds of conversations are a little bit harder for me to have when I'm back home. For a lot of us, it's hard to have these kinds of conversations, especially when we're calling out people that we feel are continuing the cycle of toxic masculinity. So those are the types of things I want to be able to call out. And there might be words in this presentation that might conjure up traumatic feelings or unwanted feelings, especially around violence and aggression towards women, our LGBTQIA plus community, and violence and aggression towards men, whether that be outwardly or inwardly. So those are just some things I really want to make sure that we can clear up beforehand. And if you've ever been to like a conference or you've been to a seminar, many people start off by giving a land acknowledgement. Since we're in a virtual setting, I want to give a thoughts acknowledgement. That is, one, I want to take ownership of certain privileged identities that I share. This is very important. I've done masculinity presentations for many years now. I've involved myself in a lot of conversations. And one of the things I understand is that as a heterosexual cisgender man, my voice carries more weight and goes further because I have those identities. Typically, more people believe what I have to say more than if I had a more marginalized identity. So it's important for me to be able to understand that as I involve myself and as we continue to have these kinds of conversations, that we take ownership of those privileged identities. And these kinds of conversations aren't new. In fact, women of color have championed these kinds of well-being acts and advocated for men of color from the very beginning. Women of color were at the forefront of civil rights movements even before women even had as much rights as men. It is important for us to be able to understand that whenever I have these kinds of conversations, it is because I have had amazing mentors, amazing individuals who happen to be women, who have always been doing this work, and I could not have been here without them. And one of the other things I also want to talk about is the justifying for programs centered around masculinity. There exists male privilege. So whenever we talk about like what kind of programs or events need to be held around masculinity, it's kind of like, well, why? The reason is because masculinity has found its way in every single facet of daily lives, whether that be in education, whether that be how we interact with our family, friends, significant others, the gender wage gap, everything. It is a part of what we do. So we have to be able to understand how we can not only just deconstruct these types of masculine and machismo identities, but also how we can go further. And by the end of this presentation, there will be some tasks, some action items that we can do. So why is there such a huge prevalence of need to talk about masculinity, especially for our Latinx community? One of the things that we have to understand is that toxic masculinity teaches to hide from discomfort and our own prejudices and faults. And whenever we talk about masculinity, we're talking about a certain type of box that was created for men to achieve, that we have to fit in. However, that box, those expectations were not created and formulated by men of color. We live in a white supremacist, patriarchal society. So masculinity was created in order to fit those molds. So men of color, especially Latinx men, do not fit those roles many times because of our cultural backgrounds. So we start off by talking about our identity, our gender identity as a male man, as an hombre, but also we also measure ourselves as a man by being cisgender men. And this is where we leave out trans men in many of these kinds of conversations. The expectation of heterosexual sexual orientation. I put cisgender in there twice by accident, but also should be repeated because it's very important. There also exists a notion that in order to be a man, in order to be masculine, one must be tough and in order to gain respect. I used to do this presentation with college-age men. It was in the Freshman Male Dialogue series. And we would always have conversations around what pride and what respect was. And for the longest time, men, especially men of color, are taught that in order to achieve respect, in order to gain respect from other individuals, one must be aggressive, one must be violent, one must be always achieving and displaying their masculinity. So pride and aggressiveness and violence are inherently tied with one another, especially around our Latinx community and in masculinity for Latino men. And at the very end, success. Success is one of the things that is highly valued within Latino masculinity. It is one of the things that you initially achieve, but you have to continue to achieve that, which is a lot like masculinity. Masculinity isn't something that you keep. It isn't something that is awarded to you and then it is yours forever. In fact, it's quite the opposite. It is a constant struggle to perform masculine tasks and masculine behavior in order to prove oneself. And that is where the tiredness comes in. That is where a lot of these things come from. So a little bit more about myself in terms of like my privileged identities, especially when I'm talking about Latino identities. I am a heterosexual cisgender man, but I am also the youngest and only boy to a Mexican household. I can already feel people judging me, okay? I completely understand all of the things that come along with that. My parents are both from Mexico. So when their youngest child is their only boy, I grew up spoiled. All right. I completely understand that. So it's an honor for me to be able to have these kinds of conversations because we have to be able to try and unlearn so many of the things, especially within the Latinx community, of what we are socially taught to do, what our social norms are and what our expectations are as brown men, as brown boys. And here's one of the things that I continue to believe in. One of the most important steps in connecting with men of color is telling them that they are not alone in what they're experiencing. My first year in college, I was involved in the student organization called Hombres Unidos. And I joined it because I wanted to get some friends. I'm originally from San Antonio, Texas, and I went to school at Texas State University, which is only 50 minutes north of San Antonio, but I felt completely out of place. I grew up in the inner city of San Antonio, and everyone that I knew around me was Hispanic, was a Latinx individual. So I got to Texas State, I got to college, and I felt like a fish out of water. I had no idea what I was supposed to do, what I was supposed to even look like. And I felt so alone. So I joined the student organization called Hombres Unidos, And I found my friends, I found my support group. And this was the beginning of me having these kinds of conversations. Because as we kind of built our community with one another, we found that so many of us had the same experiences growing up. So many of us didn't know how to ask for help. So many of us were afraid to show their feelings. So many of us didn't have great relationships with our fathers. So many of us were just taught to be afraid of vulnerability and to share our truths. So as we're taught this growing up, especially within Latinx households, you take that from home to a brand new place like college. Men feel alone, which is a terrifying feeling that many individuals share. And one of the first things I had to learn was that we had to be able to connect with one another. We had to be able to share that it was okay to go through these things as long as you were prepared to share with what you did not know. There exists this culture of not being able to ask for help, because asking for help is a sign of weakness within a large community of the Latinx population, especially for men of color. So we didn't know what we were doing. We just knew that we were friends with one another and we wanted to help each other. And that was it. And that was the first step. The second step was being able to understand why we were feeling these things and how we can undo that. Men of color interpret their masculinity much differently than white men due to racial biases. See, I grew up in San Antonio, where I typically always fit the description of what police officers are looking for. I grew up with wearing baggy tall tees and dicky pants and shorts with the shaved head and an edge up and a taper fade, everything. And I got to college and I didn't look like anybody there. I went to, while Texas State was still a predominantly white institution, I again felt out of place. I had no idea what I was supposed to be doing. But men of color experience their masculinity on a much different level than white men. See, as we talk about what men are supposed to look like and perform, there still exists a stereotype and a prejudice for men of color. Whenever we talk about what men are supposed to be, we talk about what they're supposed to be, aggressive. Boys will be boys, right? Violence is a thing. Aggression is fine. That's an expectation. However, there exist stereotypes for men of color, especially for Black and brown men, that we are somehow hyper violent and hyper aggressive. So even then, masculinity does not treat men of color the same way. It historically has not, and is meant to somehow protect us or protect other people from us, specifically white women. So that is a detail that men of color have grown up internalizing before our entire lives. And that identities that many men of color share forces them to act out their masculinity in order to survive. You see, I performed the way I did growing up because I needed to. I grew up in inner city where I had to act tough. I had to act as though I knew what I was doing, that I didn't, so that nobody would pick on me, so I wouldn't be singled out. Being singled out was the worst possible thing. But then I realized that I couldn't do that in college. It wasn't the same environment anymore. That's not what was going to allow me to be successful. I had to learn other ways in which I could survive in a different space, which is very difficult for many men. For many men to be able to learn that they have to unlearn their survival tactics. You see, my name is Lionel, spelled Lionel. But for the very first beginning, for the first 22 years of my life, I had gone by Lionel. My mom named me Lionel. My mom came to America with a few dollars, and she immediately she was a housekeeper. My father was a migrant worker, and he's now a land surveyor. So my mom told me that I had to be able to survive in this country by performing certain acts. And I asked her, Mom, why is my name Lionel and not Leonel? My father's name is Leonel, Leonel. And I got the I. I go, Mom, why did I get the I? I don't understand. And she said, because it sounded more American. And that was a 180 from everything, right? My mom had to do that because she knew, as a first generation American, as a first generation student, I did not have the same rights as other individuals, especially white men. And so I was mad. I was upset at first, but then I was just kind of like, my mom had to do this. My mom didn't have the money to protect me from society. My mom didn't have the social capital to protect me from police officers or from the judicial system. She didn't do that. She couldn't do that. But what she could do was give me a name that would allow me to pass as American. It was one of the reasons why she didn't teach me Spanish growing up. She didn't want to teach me Spanish because she didn't want me to be put in ESL classes. Those are survival tactics that immigrant parents have to enforce on their children in order for them to survive. And then those men of color then take on new survival tactics in order to survive. And it looks a lot differently when you join college. So this is how those things manifest. I call it mijo syndrome. Mijo syndrome is a lot like when, let's say, men of color, especially Latinx men, are spoiled by their families just for being boys. So they kind of grow up with this idea that they can get away with stuff. That's mijo syndrome. My partner is a nurse, and she was a nurse in San Antonio. Lots of mijo syndrome there. So these are the ways in which mijo syndrome kind of portrays itself. This is how it shows in other places. One of the things about mijo syndrome is that it teaches us to be emotionally stunted. Men are not taught to share their emotions in a healthy way. A lot of individuals are unable to voice the challenges in healthy ways, right? Typically, men aren't taught to be emotional, but they are taught to show anger, which is an emotion. That is a feeling. But the only ways in which they can show emotion and be emotional is through violence, is through anger and aggression.
What is that?
They're also taught to avoid sadness and to avoid leaning on others. And there is a reluctance to help. Those are examples of emotionally stunted young men. Aggressive reactions towards being challenged is another one. You have to be able to understand that the defending your masculinity at all costs is a defense mechanism, because we understand that masculinity is something that you take away at the drop of a hat. That violence towards women in our LGBTQIA plus community are both physical and emotional, are ways in which individuals manifest their toxic masculinity, in which you manifest toxic machismo. And that these harmful reactions when not getting in their way, these are what happens. You avoid vulnerability. I always ask men in these workshops that I do, how vulnerability was taught to you. How were you encouraged to be vulnerable, to self-reflect on who you are as an individual, especially reflecting on your faults? And most of the time, 95% of the time, I always get, I was never taught to be vulnerable. I have no idea how to be vulnerable. So avoiding vulnerability, it manifests itself in keeping things from your significant others. Avoid telling home of your challenges. I could not tell home that I was going through depression when I was in college. I couldn't do that because I left home. I made this choice to leave home, where so many Latinx individuals are taught not to leave home. So I felt that, like, if I told my family that I was sad, that I was going through very difficult hardships, that I would be failing them. And I couldn't tell them in a healthy way. So instead I just got angry because I didn't know how to be sad. And it also manifests itself in policing others, chastising men for not being masculine enough, holding women to certain social expectations, and also making anti-LGBTQIA plus comments. Those are ways in which we police other men in order to uphold our certain expectations of what masculinity is supposed to look like. So, why is it important for us to talk specifically about masculinity for men of color? Because within masculinity for men of color, there is a sheer importance of family as a motivation in order to complete your college degree. So much weight is put on men of color to not only go to college, if you do go to college, but to graduate and then come back home to provide for your family. After my first semester of Texas State University, I went home. It was Christmas break, right? And my tia Mary was like, "Ay, mijo, like how was your semester? How's school?" I go, "It's fine, it's okay, I guess." She goes, "Well, hurry up and graduate because your parents need help." And I was like, "You know, tia, like I hardly ate last week because I was so stressed. I didn't have any money. I don't even know what I'm doing in January. I don't even know if I can really even go back." But already this expectation of how I was supposed to perform for my family was already placed upon me. Men of color are also less likely to participate in college organizations, in campus organizations, initiatives, or support groups. So it's not a coincidence that men of color, specifically Black and brown men, have the highest dropout rates in college. It's not a coincidence at all that men who don't know how to tell like each other or create support systems, that they just drop out. It's not a coincidence at all. We have to be able to tie these things together and not just make it a singular act. And for a large portion of our community, for our Latinx community, the stigmatization of mental health and counseling is a sheer issue. Our defense mechanisms around our mental health like limits us in being able to be successful in college. For some reason, asking for help and not knowing the answers is looked down upon when you're in college, but college is the one place where you're supposed to ask those questions. And it's not just asking those questions about your classes, but asking questions about yourself, asking questions about where you can be as an individual, asking questions and finding mentors and people that you can look up to, people who have had similar experiences as yourself. Prioritizes pride and respect above all else. Those are things that men understand is one of the first things. If you want to start a fight on a playground between young boys, just point out, ask the question, who is the person that's most likely to get picked on? Who is the most sissy person here? And men will defend themselves because they cannot stand to see themselves as less masculine than other individuals. That attaches pride and respect to aggression. It is something that you have to continually achieve. And that the only emotions that are acceptable are ones that allow you to be more dominant than other people. I ask this question all the time. I did this presentation for Texas Lutheran University around sexual assault and toxic masculinity. And these individuals, they were athletes and they were men of color. And I asked them, what did it mean to be men when you were growing up? What were some of the things that you were taught? And they said, well, I couldn't show emotion. I didn't know how to show emotion. Don't show your feelings. And I said, cool. All right, just making sure. How many times have you been on the football field and told, I need you to get angry. I need you to get mad. I need you to get that frustration out there on the field. And they all raised their hands and they said daily. And I go, those are emotions. Those are feelings. The only difference is that we've associated more value to certain emotions than others. And especially if we're talking about our Latinx community, we have to also be able to recognize the prevalence of anti-Blackness and anti-LGBTQIA sentiments in the Latinx community. We can't talk about liberating men of color without liberating all men of color. We cannot be able to speak and be silent around the anti-Blackness that exists in Hispanic households. And also how we are taught to be fearful of LGBTQIA plus identities. My sister once asked my mom, would you rather Lionel be gay or would you rather him date a Black woman? My mom thought about it for a hot second and she said, I'd rather him be gay. I heard that when I was 19 years old. I'm not the only person in hearing those sentiments. Those exist throughout our entire community. Those affect how we see our masculinity as men of color. And that to be able to abide by masculinity definition, it's rooted within white cisgender constructs that forces everyone to comply or be exiled. And it's important for us to understand that the individuals who defend masculinity the most are those that benefit the most from it. Who defines masculinity? Who benefits from it? And they're typically the same individuals. We have to feel comfortable in challenging them. So whenever I think about machismo, I don't think about it just in terms of, we got to stop saying X, Y, and Z. There is an entire system and pillars that uphold machismo. And I genuinely believe, hot take of the day, I genuinely believe that all of these factors uphold toxic machismo. Cultural expectations, racism, sexism, misogyny, homophobia, classism. And this is how they kind of exhibit themselves. Our cultural expectations, especially around gender, how brown men and brown women are expected to behave, whether in the household or later in life. Those gender expectations affect how we interpret our identities as gender, our gender identities, our value on respect. The racism that exists in upholding toxic machismo obviously is an anti-Blackness that we just talked about. The inequality in education. Understand that there exists a system that purposely undervalues the education for brown, especially first-generation Black and brown communities. Those are the building blocks of how we build our communities, and how women of color are traditionally undervalued and underrepresented, whether it be in our politics and our movies and shows and our advocacy work. Women of color have historically been disenfranchised, even though women of color have led the movements in order for these things to be happening. Misogyny, sexism, all of these things and violence towards individuals exist. So whenever men, especially men, say, I'm not sexist, man. I don't do any of those things. I don't make sexist jokes. I say, good for you. You are at that's bottom level. That's base. That's where you start off. And especially if you're in that system, you're literally only working on this aspect of sexism, of misogyny, of toxic masculinity. There exists a plethora of other things that we need to be able to understand and undo. We talked about the prevalence of homophobia and anti-LGBTQIA sentiments, whether that be not involving gay men and trans men in the conversations around masculinity. They're typically pushed aside. They're typically disenfranchised. And when it comes to classism, I come to terms like it's like we're too white. Now, especially if we're talking about our Latinx community, we might have heard terms like coconut. I can't see y'all, but this is like where I typically say, like, if you've ever heard the term coconut, raise your hand. I'd raise my hand, right? Coconut typically means that you are brown on the outside but white on the inside. If you've watched Gentified, Netflix, great show, you should give it a try. They call one of the characters a coconut because he's white on the inside, even though he's from LA, right? And he's a Latinx individual. Another hot take. Calling individuals, especially Latinx individuals, coconuts is one of the most damaging things that we can do, not just to that individual, but to our entire community. The reason being, what it does is that it associates certain expectations and levels of success with whiteness and with our brown community. Typically, when we're talking about people who are too white, they are either educated, they are financially stable, they have material goods, they come from a pretty stable family. You put all those things together and you somehow achieve whiteness. But what that does is it sets a ceiling towards our community. It sets a ceiling to what we can achieve as a community. See, as soon as I left the inner city of San Antonio to go to college, my cousins immediately said, "What do you know, schoolboy? You don't even know about the hood." And I go, "Bro, I was just here like a month ago." What happens is we have put so much of an emphasis on maintaining our identity as Latinx individuals and what it means to be Hispanic, what it means to be Mexican American, what it means to be Central American and South American. We have put so much of a meaning, and we have put fear in losing that identity to the point where we have set a ceiling into what we can achieve. It is weird for me to not go back home to San Antonio after college. I live in Austin now. It is so odd for me and my family to not be together. It was odd for me to say, I'm not going to go back home. I want to make my own thing. I want to go elsewhere. I got so much pushback from my family when I said that. They did not believe in me. And it was a tragic thing to hear. So whenever I hear things like coconut, I said, you're not helping us. We need to be able to go beyond that. We have to be able to allow that individual to achieve what their idea of success is. My pride is everything. This is something that men of color understand from the very beginning. That pride can be achieved by anger, by violence, misbehaving in school. Young boys have decided that misbehaving in school is okay if you're trying to establish your pride and respect with other individuals. It is no coincidence that men of color have the highest rates of disciplinary measures put on them. Not just because of racism, which is extremely prevalent, but the fact that we have put so much fear in not being deemed as masculine enough. Aggression is extremely normalized within our Latinx community for young boys. Sexual conquest is a huge one, and how we kind of deem ourselves of who we are as individuals and as men. Terms like get back at them, show them who you really are. Revenge, especially when someone has attacked your masculinity. Make them respect you, as if you can make someone respect you through anger and through violence. Our reluctance to ask for help, because help somehow is attached to weakness. One of the things I would always have in conversations with my peers were, if I don't know the answer right now, do I even deserve to have it later on? That was one thing that I heard over and over again. Not being able to ask for help, our reluctance to say, I don't know enough right now. I need to know more. Don't be a blank, and you can put anything there. Typically, it is around something that is feminine or deals with our female identities. And get as many girls as you can. In my first year of college, I got so many text messages and phone calls like from friends. They were like, yo, like, you go to Texas State. Like, what are the parties like? What are the girls like? Like, what have you done out there? You having fun? No one ever asked me how my tests were. Like, no one was ever like, yo, I heard you had a test. What's that like? Wait, how'd you do? No one ever asked me that. No one ever asked me like, hey man, how you holding up? And I wish they did. I wish I could find time to be vulnerable with other individuals. But I couldn't. There were just ways in which men were expected to perform and behave in college. And this idea that masculinity is not forever. Masculinity has been defined by our peers, family, media, and our society at large. While the notion of masculinity is brought up with intentions to help men accelerate in the world they live in, it also inherently leaves others out of the conversation, specifically our LGBTQIA individuals, especially women, especially gender fluid individuals. If masculinity was about helping other people achieve something, everybody would be included, but it's not. It is solely about them achieving something within themselves. Masculinity within the Western sense of it is a performance action that limits genuine expression and constricts men and others what they can be. See, I went into college with a social work degree. I wanted to be a social worker, and I ended up getting my bachelor's in social work. It was amazing. I love it. I didn't pursue it, but I love studying social work. But even when I was in high school and I said, I'm going to be a social worker, So many people were like, why? Especially men in my family, other men and friends of mine who are also brown were like, why? One, they don't make any money because financial success is a huge portion of masculinity, right? Around success. But also, like, why would you want to help other people, bro? Like, my dad told me growing up there are no such thing as friends. Why would you try and help other people? There is this idea of our individualistic mindset, especially within our Latinx community for men. And the policing of men and others, regardless of gender identity, impacts everyone as we live in a society that largely benefits heterosexual cisgender men, white men. And as we evolve into new definition of what masculinity can include, these outdated norms exist within pockets of comfort. This is what I genuinely believe. Violence towards other individuals from men, specifically violence towards women, is not organic. Violence towards our LGBTQI community by men is not organic. And what I mean is this. There exists comfort pockets where men kind of get by without being checked, without being corrected. Sexist joke here, an anti-LGBTQI comment here. So many different ways in which toxic masculinity is exhibited always go unchecked because it's expected that men behave that way. And what you ultimately get is a sheer cut example of aggression, whether that be a boyfriend that murders their partner, their girlfriend, their wife, whether that be an individual who performs awful mass casualty events. They always say the same thing. I couldn't expect it. I couldn't see this coming. This is brand new to me. I don't understand how this happened. It's because there were systems beforehand that set all of those motions into place. The more and more that we are reluctant to call out these sheer examples of misogyny, of anti-LGBTQIA sentiments, the more that we are unable to call these things out, the more and more that these acts of violence will occur. And policing, the idea of policing enforces the idea that manhood can not only be acquired but taken away. It is something that at the drop of a hat by other men can be taken away. But here's the thing about masculinity. There's no shared guideline or there's no book to it. What it essentially is for young brown men is posturing yourself with other men. But that's what everyone is doing. So it's like the blind leading the blind. You're just trying to one-up one another. And what you have are just awful examples of what being a man should be and how they should behave. And those young men grow up to be adults and they carry on this cycle. Policing and enforcing toxic characteristics of masculinity exist not to ensure all men remain men, but to ensure that their vision of manhood is kept the same. You see, we don't uphold toxic masculinity or we don't uphold what being a man is because we think it's going to help other individuals. It's because we don't want to challenge what masculinity looks like for myself. The moment that you attack what my masculinity is, the less power I have. And as we've already stated, masculinity, especially toxic masculinity, is in the brown community, is about power, is about dominance, is about establishing pride and respect for other people, for yourself. And policing serves to excuse unhealthy behaviors and put blame on others in order to continue to live in insecurity. One of the things that I've always said is that I remember the very first time that I said I was sorry without being prompted. I didn't even know how to apologize when I was young. You see, the only times I ever said I was sorry was when I was in trouble. It was during a fight. It was when I was being called out on something. So whenever I said I was sorry, it means I was being defensive. I was always ready to be defensive and put up my defense mechanisms. So I was afraid to say I was sorry. I was afraid to be vulnerable. So we have emotionally stunted men who are afraid to say that they're sorry, to say that I have faults and I'm trying to work on them, to actually take time to reflect on other individuals. And men feel sad. Men do feel sad, but the only ways in which they can exhibit being sad is through anger, is through frustration. And we need to be able to teach men, especially young brown boys, that being sad is okay, that they don't have to perform their sadness and and their confusion through anger and violence. And typically only individuals who meet the societal norms of masculinity do the policing. And which is why it's important for us to continue to evolve what masculinity looks like and how it can be. So so about a year ago, I had these conversations with men here on campus, specifically around Latino masculinity. And I asked them a few questions. And one of the sentiments was like, if I ask for help, it makes me look weak. So these were a few of the statements that these students, who I believe they were seniors at the time, they were about to graduate. These were some of the examples that they learned during college. Asking for help was new. I didn't know mental health was a thing. I thought no one would understand. And I continue to hear these stories and these examples, and I continue to think this is why it is cyclical. And these men were privileged enough to go to college and learn that you can ask for help. One of the other things that men were saying, that another student was saying, that was asking for help is different than what I knew growing up because of the stigma attached to it. We were raised to neglect certain feelings, especially around counseling. And another student said, he was lonely his freshman year. He was never used to being away from a family. And that what actually helped him was bringing a towel and blanket from home. Men of color seek affection. Men of color seek connection. Men of color seek genuine attachment with other individuals. But we're not taught to say that. We're not taught to actually show that and what it actually looks like. I have to provide for my family, those examples that I was talking about before. You see, students, one of the students said, I felt pressure to succeed. I didn't want to come home and feel like I let them down. It's hard because no one else went through this process. So many of our Latinx community are first generation students. So when they go through college and they experience the unique hardships of being a first generation college student, who do they have to look up to? Who, if they're a first generation and no one else in their family has gone to college, how can they talk about what they're going through? No one else can really understand them, which is important for us, which is why it's important for us to tell our young men as they enter college, find a support system, build a group, find a mentor. One of the other students said, I didn't have a dad growing up. Growing up with my mom, I got motherly advice. It was different than people who had a dad. And lastly, I felt I had to bottle this all. When I finally went to counseling, I had a positive experience. But then the student also said he later saw his father go through the exact same things that he was going through, and that he wished his father would do the same in seeking counseling. And that really affected that student because he understood that he took out that time and the ability to actually go against what he had been taught to do as a young boy and hope that his father would do the same thing. But his father never did. And that there were things that these students had to unlearn. Oh, sorry. Oh my gosh. That the student said, I started communicating with what I needed. All of my responsibilities kept me from telling my girlfriend what I needed. If individuals, especially young men, cannot even communicate with their significant others what they're going through, who can they entrust this information in? Typically, it's with other men, but once they are either intoxicated or they're in a sporting arena or somewhere where they feel comfortable. But other than that, there aren't many places in which men, especially men who are not taught to be vulnerable, actually detail what they're going through. Another students that I had to let go of carrying all the weight on my own, finding a mentor that can relate to me as an immigrant. The student was also an undocumented immigrant. So his pressures, his daily pressures, then exceeded what other individuals or other students were going through. And that another student saying that being aggressive changed. Where you're brought up, being taught to be aggressive is the way to do it. Here in college, it's not the same. I had to let go of selfishness, letting go of something difficult. And finally, a student said he had to let go of hate that he had for a person. This was for his absent father. He asked, why do I have so much hatred and how am I carrying it in life? He had to learn forgiveness and peace. So this is the unlearning that we have to encourage, not just for men, but for all gender identities. You see, I say that because it is not just men who perpetuate these ideas of social and gender expectations for our Latinx community. It is men, it is women, it is individuals of differing genders, whether they be non-binary, gender non-conforming. Socialization happens to everyone, which is a reason why it's important to talk about how our own mothers can also perpetuate toxic masculinity, whether it be establishing different expectations for their sons than their daughters. So we have to reconsider outdated gender norms, that policing are typical, and that remembering that policing are from those that benefit from the most. Vulnerability and honesty can come without anger. Identity is meant to develop and evolve over time. As I continue to talk about masculinity, I understand that this is not a set in stone thing. The ways in which we have these conversations can be undone and they can be completely different, but we have to understand that our identity as men can evolve and change. It is never just one thing and there's one definition. In fact, it means different things from either today, from tomorrow, to a few years from now. And we need to be more honest with the men and how they interact with such things as mansplaining, misogyny, sexual violence, and silence, especially as we delve into new conversations around proper allyship. And this is more for our higher education people, but the 3 Ps. When I took on this job, I got asked the question, how do we engage with men of color? And I said, if I knew that answer, I would write a book and make a lot of money. But this is essentially how I think that we can fully engage with men of color or any kind of students on campus. Oh, let's talk about right here. The 3 Ps are, if we're going to be doing something, they have to be peer driven. Students, especially men of color, our Latinx community, look onto other men for how to perform and how to behave. So when they see students behaving and doing one thing, they kind of believe in it a little bit more. We also have to make these experiences personal to them, understanding that their interpretation of their identities affect how they interact with the people around them, whether that be with their family members or friends, siblings, significant others. We have to be able to make it personal. And the last thing is making it persistent. It is probably the hardest part, because it's not just being persistent in terms of making sure that we continue to have these conversations on campus, but also that all of the systems around them are also having these conversations. I've done presentations to athletics here at St. Edward's, which is great. And I can have as many discussions and facilitate as many workshops as I want. But if those kinds of conversations aren't being held in their locker rooms, if those kinds of conversations aren't being held with their friend groups, it's essentially for naught. There's hardly anything is ever going to get done. So we need to make these events and we need to make these initiatives peer-driven, personal, and persistent. So this is my call to action, and this is as we wrap up. Removing the generalization that this is a women's issue. So many times conversations around gender studies and sexuality is deemed as women's studies or women's issue or LGBTQIA issues. It is not. This affects everyone. We also need to put a complete halt to normalizing men's violence, aggression, and anger. There is nothing normal about it. Recognize that masculinity as a gender, that white is a race, and heterosexuality is a sexual orientation. And we need to be more honest with men in how they interact with such things as mansplaining, misogyny, violence, and silence. We also have to remove the narrative that only women, specifically survivors, are solely responsible for preventing sexual violence. Meaning, we need to stop telling women how to behave in order for them to avoid violence. We also need to tell men that they play a part of this as well. Remember that when female students enter college campuses, they are given either pepper spray or a taser. But what families give sons, condoms. That is a sheer, distinct example of how sex is used in order to dominate others. We are telling one gender one thing and telling another gender a different thing. Resisting the hypersexualized LGBTQIA stereotype, creating transphobic fears, and understanding that we are all at risk of perpetuating harmful actions, regardless of your gender identity. Understanding that we make up a part of this socialized world that we are in. So as I leave you, these are a few things that I want you to understand. One, it is not enough to be pro-feminism, but to be anti-sexism. It is not enough to be pro-Black or brown, but to be anti-racist. And that we have to remember that radical reformation is radical activism. Working towards undoing a cycle that has been long-standing is radical activism. That it is brave, that it is long, and that it continues for a lifetime. And I want to say thanks, y'all, because y'all is gender inclusive. That is my presentation for Latino masculinities. I can continue to go on and on and on. So if you want to ever connect with me, please feel free. My email is right there, llopez14@stedwards.edu. And that's what I have. I'll leave this up. I think I have a few minutes for questions or something.
Yes, definitely. Does anybody have any questions? Don't leave yet. You'll have to fill out a survey and your attendance so you can get your free goodies. But before we do that, does anybody have questions? Let's go ahead and give a virtual applause. Yes. Anybody? Great. So questions or thoughts? No, the attendance has not been taken. Not yet. Questions. It's because they're gonna get free goodies, Leona. That's why.
Okay, that's fine.
They get vouchers and T-shirts and stuff.
I love it.
Slow clap. Somebody put slow clap. Preach.
Oh, cool.
The comments.
I love the chats.
Great. Questions. Leonel is taking questions. I'm going to get the links while you all ask questions. Thoughts from anybody?
Yeah, if anybody has any thoughts, questions, I also love critiques. So if there's something that you want to challenge me on, please do so. I am not one that shies away from critiques as well. I hope that I'm glad that people enjoyed it. Does anybody have any examples that they'd like to share or anything like that? I don't know.
Well, I think you brought up very good points, Leonel, especially about women of color and just about culture and background. And I loved how you talked about oppression, power, and like you even mentioned privilege and different identities and just growing up. So I really thank you for sharing your experiences and kind of like your life and your upbringing and how that has affected you. And so thank you so much for sharing your experience. I know as me, as a woman of color, as a first generation as well, identify as Mexican American, a lot of the stories and stuff that you were saying, I have two brothers. I'm the only identified female in my home. And so a lot of the stuff that you were saying, I've heard it in my own home growing up. So yeah, definitely relate to that. So thank you so much.
Yeah, Saliha Garcia, I'm sorry if I completely mispronounced your name, asked a quick question. What is the hardest part of educating those who enables machismo? The hardest part for me, I don't know. It used to be that like people would see me differently, but at the same time, see me differently. I don't mind it. I think one of the hardest parts that has been constantly reaffirming to myself that what I'm doing is worth it. I am not like without having imposter syndrome. Even though I've been having these kind of conversations for years, imposter syndrome still affects me, where I still feel as if like I am not worthy to have these kinds of conversations, or I'm still not educated enough to like give presentations like this. So I think that's definitely a part of it. I've been doing this for at least 10 years now. I got into my first year of college was 2010. That was when I graduated from high school. So like just constantly having to tell myself that what I'm doing is worth it, is making differences, it is making a positive change. I I think that is one of the hardest parts, but also it's one of the most rewarding aspects as well. Have you seen a difference in the last few years about this topic? I think so. I do think so. We're talking about a generation of students who are in college at the moment who are most technologically savvy, connected individuals, and where we have many women and men who are both calling out these examples of harmful masculinity, and they're being able to call it out. So I have seen it. However, there are still so many outdated things and so many different blind spots. We have to be able to make sure that we're talking about our LGBTQIA community. We have to be able to talk about how certain identities come into play with how we interpret our identities, especially around masculinity. So I have, and there's been a lot of different ways that it has exhibited itself. So yeah.
Great. Oh, there's more comments.
Yes. So Sharon, you bring up a great topic. You bring up a good point. But an observation. But men need to hear most than anyone yet. Mostly women are tuning in. Props to the men that are here. Absolutely, absolutely. Which is why I kind of wanted to make sure that this presentation wasn't geared towards only male-identified students. That was like a huge push for me, which is why I started off by saying that I didn't want to gender any of my language. But it's absolutely true, and that has been one of the hardest parts of like kind of having and engaging these conversations. I do it with my nieces. I have two nieces and I have a nephew, and I've made them like attend a few of my my masculinity talks. And it's typically my nieces who are like, "Oh, I want to know more about this." I'm like, "Dope, do it, and then call this out. You should totally do it." But you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right, and that goes into the kind of conversation of how we can undo a lot of these outdated and harmful norms.
Hello, I have a question, Leonard.
Sure, what's up?
Adding a follow up on the whole, having women tune in and the few men that we have here, how can we have more engagement within the men here, on campus, events or, topics like these?
Yeah, that goes back into my 3 Ps, peer, making these events peer driven, personal, and persistent. I think when we have conversations around masculinity, we deem it as if it's something that only affects other people and not themselves. We have to understand that our identities don't exist in a vacuum, right? My identity as a man, as a Latino individual exists and interacts with one another, right? But how I internally like reflect and internalize these identities is going to affect how I interact with the systems around me. And I need to understand that I play a part in doing a lot of these kinds of conversations. I think the best way that we can begin to have to engage men of color, specifically like Latinx men, especially around masculinity, is making this personal to them. Whenever I start off these conversations, I always say, look, I am not here to change your interpretation of masculinity. I can't do that, because our interpretations of masculinity stem from our life experiences. And I can't come in as an outsider and tell you how to interpret your life experiences. I can't do that. But what I can do is just offer you a different perspective. What I can do is come in and try and give you an example of how we affect ourselves and those around us. So that's really been a thing that's kind of helped me out. Obviously, there's still a lot of work to do. There's so much that we can continue to build on. But we have to find out what students want to hear and where students are, right? We have to do pre-evaluations. We have to do post-evaluations. We have to be able to hear what our students want to learn and then acclimate our educational systems to that. Remember that our identities are continuing to evolve. So figuring out where they are in their development is extremely important, as we begin to figure this out. I'm doing a masculinity initiative for St. Edward's right now, and part of it was just incorporating students, student voices, student groups, students that looked like them, and then inviting them. Would you say that mothers also pose an enormous influence on Latino men's masculinity? Do you play an important role in their machismo, misogyny? Do they play? Yes. Yeah. That's where Mijo syndrome comes from. That's definitely where it comes from. I always have this kind of conversations, especially like with Latina women, and they always say, you know, my brother was able to go out whenever he wanted, but I couldn't do what I wanted to do most of the time. Or, you know, my brother was encouraged to go to college outside of our town, but like I had to stay home and live at home. Absolutely. This is an issue. This is a topic that's perpetuated of all individuals, regardless of gender identity. So they do, especially as we have men who really look up to their parental figures. An example of how I combated this with my own mom was, this is just a small example. I'm not sure this has anything to really do with it, but see, I have my master's degree, which is dope. It's amazing. I love it. I still feel like they're going to take it away one day. But my mom would always go around and tell people, I'm like, mijo, like, se fue a la escuela y ya está trabajando. Like, yeah, he's working and I'm so proud of him. He never had any issues. Everything was easy. And I said, Mom, it was not easy. While I have male privilege, like I did face racism on my college campus. I have been discriminated against. I have been faced with many adversities and had to unlearn so many different things that I was brought up learning. And that's how I eventually got here. So while my mom goes play loteria with her comadres, like I have to be able to tell her it was not easy for me. I had to undo and like somehow go up against an entire system that has been systemically meant to disenfranchise Latinx communities, especially first generation Latinx communities. I hope that answers your question. How do you suggest one individual actor can help his friends engage and actively listen to the changes they need to stop perpetuating toxic masculinity? Oh, the first step that we have to do is understand ourselves. That is the first thing. It's easy for us to try and educate other people, right? It's easy for us to try and learn about other people and tell them like how they should be behaving. The harder part of that is doing that within ourselves. See, the first time that I apologized to someone without being prompted, it was with a partner, with my significant other that I had in college. And what I did was like, I said, look, I'm sorry. And we were on our way to Taco Cabana, and I said, I'm sorry. I have defense mechanisms that I've had since growing up. And I'm sorry that I have unleashed that upon our relationship with you. I am not perfect, but I'm willing to learn how I can undo this. That self-reflection piece was the most bold thing I'd ever done at that part. That ability to be vulnerable with myself and with her was the paradigm shift that I needed in order to work with other men of color. I needed to be honest with myself first, right? Like it's kind of like social work, what social work teaches you. Social work teaches you can't help others if you can't help yourself first. I can't tell other people how to learn more about with a certain system if I don't even know what kind of system I play a part in that. That is how we undo the system. That is how we deconstruct it. So we have to learn how we play a part of it. This might be a long answer, but this is something that's very important. This is what I tell all of my students. I want for us to think about traffic. Whenever we think about traffic, we think about us being stuck in traffic, right? Like, oh man, I was trying to get to work, even though like I got up in time, especially here in Austin. I got stuck in traffic. I hate being stuck in traffic. I shift the narrative on that. I don't believe that anybody ever gets stuck in traffic. People make up traffic. You're on the highway and you are in traffic, you make up traffic. Just like the people in front of you, just like the people behind you, you are a member of that traffic. I am a member of traffic, especially when it comes to patriarchal and toxic masculinity. Even though I did everything right, even though I woke up in time, I walked my dogs, I ate breakfast, I got ready in time, and I hit 35 here in Austin, I hit traffic, I make up traffic, even though I did everything right. It is the same thing here. We have to be able to understand our own role in these systems, because we also have to understand that there are individuals that, while you may be in traffic, there may be individuals who don't even have a means to work. There may not even be individuals who have access. I make up traffic. We make up traffic. And the quicker that I'm able to understand that, the quicker it is for me to go in and take it apart. So, Cecilia, I hope that that kind of answers your question.
Yes. So before we wrap up, I know we had one question. I think you accidentally missed it from owner. Did you answer that one before we wrap up? What's the hardest habit?
Oh, yeah. What was the hardest habit to break when changing your mindset? And is there anything you wish you had done differently to help you get over that habit? My defense mechanisms. That was the most important thing for me. I didn't know I had defense mechanisms. I didn't know that I didn't know how to be sad. I didn't know that anytime I felt sad, I was angry that I was sad. And I would rather perform my frustration and my sadness through being aggressive with other people. So my habit of just being silent, of closing myself off, but my habit of pushing other people away when I felt like they were challenging me, that was one of the most important things I had to learn that I was doing without even noticing. It was something that I just did because it was second nature. And the best way that I did that was just by understanding how it affected me. And I wish I had done that a lot differently. I wish I had treated certain people in my life a lot differently. I wish that it didn't take me so long to understand that. But it's what I've understood to be one of the most important aspects. Again, like how I just said I was sorry just because I wanted to say it. That was an act of bravery for me at the moment, which is why I am vulnerable as much as possible now. I want to serve as a representative for that. I can be a brown man whose name is Lionel and be in a space in higher education in Austin, Texas, and act as someone that people can believe in, that people can trust in.
Yes, well, thank you so much. So let's give one last virtual applause to Leonel. So if you haven't filled out, thank you so much, Leonel. We really, really appreciate it. I really enjoyed your presentation. I thought it was great. Thumbs up. So thank you so much. We hope to have you in the future. And so for everybody else, a couple reminders, fill out the assessment. I put the link there and the form so you can get your t-shirt and your voucher. So a couple of questions. Starting tomorrow, you can stop by our office tomorrow from 8 to 5 or on Friday from 8 to 3 to pick up your $10 food voucher. You can buy your food downstairs from Airmark, and there's lots of good food there. So you can use your voucher, pick it up. We're in STC 224 and fill out the survey and your information so I can order your t-shirt. Your t-shirt will be here in about 2 weeks. So don't come pick it up tomorrow. We're ordering t-shirts. So thank you once again. And thank you, Leonel.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. Thank you for having me. I loved it.
All righty. Thank you so much, everybody. Y'all take care. Stay safe. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.